Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Coggin from Huntsville, Alabama. It's wonderful to be back in Sweden again. So we're going to talk about this presentation, Pwned in Space. We're going to dive into some of the topics around how space and cyber are converging and all the opportunities that are going to be out there for us as a cybersecurity industry to go and help secure this new space infrastructure that is being deployed very rapidly today. So a lot of conversation. Everyone today in enterprise and other vertical markets are, deploying cloud security, deploying cloud systems, pushing, what used to be in our private data centers up to the cloud. Well, the same thing's happening with the space industry, where the ground stations that used to be private and isolated and privately ran are now being moved to the cloud. We have companies called like Leaf Space out of Italy, Kubos, who runs their Major Tom ground station service on Amazon AWS. There's Amazon AWS is also into the space ground station business. Microsoft Azure, they have their Orbit offering where they're offering ground station services. And my understanding is now Google is managing the offering the ground station services for SpaceX. So think of the ground station as like your NOC, your network operations center, your security operations center. Well, the satellites, the spacecraft, they have the ground station that operates their networks, and these ground stations will get deployed around the world so that they can have continuous coverage depending on where things are in orbit. Now, it makes easy sense that with everything moving to the cloud here on Earth, like Amazon, Google, et cetera, that all makes sense. Just got to go get it all secure. But what is fascinating me from a cybersecurity professional standpoint is now the data centers that we used to have just on Earth are now moving to space. There's companies like Leo Cloud and others that are actually built, their business plan is to launch satellites and be able to provide cloud-based services up in space. Now, and from a cybersecurity standpoint, the questions I have is how are we going to do forensics and incident response and deal with incidents in space as the cloud gets deployed up in space? It's going to open up a whole new world of problems to solve, new services to provide, new applications, products. A lot of new thoughts as our cloud moves to space. Now, part of the technologies that are enabling that is there's companies like out of Israel called Raman Space. They've developed a terabyte hard drive that's radiation hardened that can survive the hostile environment in space that I'll go more in detail about. So with this radiation hardened hard drive, it can go and tolerate like the solar storms, all the cosmic rays, et cetera, that are out in space. It can better survive that and where we don't lose our data. So the higher storage capabilities are moving to space here. Now this really got my attention when I ran across this doing the research for this presentation, is I knew about lava tunnels. I've seen lava tunnels in Hawaii from the volcanoes on the big island in Hawaii, but I had no idea that there was a such thing as a lava tunnel on the moon. And this company Lone Star here, they're actually looking at utilizing lava tunnels that exist on the moon and putting data centers inside these lava tunnels and providing services. And the reason they're going to use these lava tunnels is, like I said, we'll go into some more detail here in a few slides about how hostile space weather is up in space due to the sun and other sources of cosmic rays. So by putting the data centers into the lava tunnels, they're hoping to be able to shield their equipment from some of that space weather. But somebody's got to put this technology in those tunnels, and what they're looking at doing is using robots. So I wanted to just give you an overview of that, because as cybersecurity professionals, network IT professionals, we're about to have our networks on the moon in lava tunnels. I find it very interesting. Now, I'm an old school network guy. My expertise is primarily in network, telecommunications, service provider networks. And this is what really, this type of thinking here has really got me interested in space, is networks like what NTT is planning to build, where NTT, the telecommunications company out of Japan, they're planning to build out a network where satellites are interconnected optically with free space optics, free space lasers, where instead of RF, everything is communicating with lasers in between the satellites and to the ground, and also have storage capabilities in space where they can have data center capabilities on the satellites. So this is really, really fascinating where we're heading, where we can have the whole, what looks like architected a telecommunications network that would normally be fiber interconnected on the ground, that is running lasers to interconnect the satellites and back to the ground with data storage capabilities all up in space. What my understanding is NTT is looking at around 2025 to start getting this network constellation built. So it's really interesting. But we're here to talk about security. So we got the slide on the counter space continuum. And what you have from a cyber threat standpoint, for the far left, you have what's typically referred to as electronic warfare, directed energy, attacks that go away when you remove the power. You could go in and start jamming a signal, start interfering with communications on a satellite, and it'll go away as soon as you remove the power for it. So it's reversible. But as you move further to the right, you start getting more kinetic, where the attacks are physical. And there's been a lot of examples in the news where missiles have been launched at satellites and destroying satellites. And what happens with that, when you do these kinetic attacks, it creates debris in space. It creates a large debris field. And there's a concern now as we move further to the right with those type of attacks, that there may end up being a large enough debris field that eventually there could be a chain reaction resulting, called a Kessler syndrome, where the chain reaction, one piece of debris or spacecraft hits another debris or spacecraft, and it just starts replicating until we have such a large debris field that the low Earth orbit is no longer usable. So that's called a Kessler syndrome. As you move further to the right, that's what we're in danger of. But there's a lot to talk about, like I said, because of the ASAT missiles that have been launched here in the last few years. But as I was doing research on this presentation, I ran across this. Was very interesting. I had no idea that actually the machine guns had been large cannons had been actually deployed up into space. Back in the 70s, the Soviet Union, they had one of the first space stations, the Alma space station. It actually had a cannon, a 23 millimeter cannon that was placed on that space station. And I found that fascinating because I'd read about the missile ASATs, but I didn't have no idea about cannons and things being put on satellite spacecraft. And there was also, so that was in the 70s, but I also read here most recently that the French are actually looking at on an upgraded Syracuse satellite. It's going to be a new satellite that's going to be put out, that they might have lasers and or submachine guns on the satellite for kinetic protection of the spacecraft, to protect the spacecraft from other spacecraft attacking it. So it's very interesting. I thought I would share that about what's going on in space from a kinetic standpoint. Now we'll get back focused on the cybersecurity. So from a cybersecurity standpoint, electronic warfare and cybersecurity are kind of converging together. It used to be the electronic warfare was its own specific domain, but now it's kind of converging. And you get into electronic warfare, you get into the whole jamming and spoofing. You hear a lot about the jamming and spoofing with the attacks on shipping and planes with GPS, where ships are showing up one place on their electronics, but they're actually in a different location. So there's a lot of that happening. And we're going to talk about some examples of malware in space, and the TT&C, how the spacecraft and the payload are controlled and flown, and how the payload is managed. And we'll talk about some vulnerabilities around replay and hijacking and eavesdropping that the satellites are vulnerable to. Now, a few years ago, it was a researcher presented on this. This was really fascinating to me, that everybody was talking about Stuxnet, but a lot of people are not aware that apparently, according to this one researcher, he's determined that Stuxnet was able to find its way into the ground station of a cable TV network in India, and from that ground station network, it was able to go and infect the satellite, the Insat 4B satellite that was in space, because apparently they were running the WinCC application and we're using the same Siemens PLC that Stuxnet targeted up on the satellite. And what the researchers believe is that the satellite couldn't rotate its solar panels, and it ended up disabling that satellite and taking that cable TV satellite out. Now, I mentioned earlier about space weather. Until I started working on my fourth master's in space, I had no idea that there was a such thing as space weather, but there is space weather. I just learned a few semesters ago. And basically what's happening is the sun is releasing all these solar rays. And you probably read about the solar storms that a lot of people are concerned about affecting the power grid. Well, what's happening is there's all these protons and ions that are being sent into space from the sun. And how that is measured is by Einstein's equation, E equal mc squared, and that where the m is the mass of these protons and ions, and then the c is the speed of light squared. And so that's what the Einstein equation is. And so I refer to what I'm about to get into is I refer to it as the Einstein denial of service, because these ions, specifically those heavy ions, they can be real angry to electronics and cause negative effects. And I'm also read recently where some of the solar activities coming in from the sun have actually affected the train infrastructure up here in northern Europe, where it's made the train tracks look busy when they really wasn't busy, things like that. And it's also, like I said, they're worried about effects possibly on the power grid. Now, one of the thoughts that I had when I started looking at space was I assumed that everything was encrypted. It's not. And the reason it's not being encrypted is because these ions that the sun is sending out, all these solar storms and things, and what happens is when the sun is sending all these ion particles through space and it hits these electronics in the satellites or say space station, it'll, everyone here understands binary and all, but think about it, it flips bits. Those ions can flip bits on your electronics, and if you're doing encryption, and you have a two-way encryption going, and you've had to exchange your encryption keys, if you start getting bits flipped, what's going to happen? You got to start resyncing. You got to get your connections rebuilt. And if we're going through a heavy solar storm, say the space weather is getting really rough for a period, maybe we lose control of the satellite because we can't get our encryption sync back up. So there's a lot of the space vendors that don't want to implement encryption on those control channels of their satellites because they don't want to lose the ability to fly their bird. Makes sense. Now, but there is a solution to that, and the solution is to do radiation hardening to the spacecraft and all the components to protect it from the ions, but that drives up the cost. And so that's the reason that there's not encryption. It's heavily recommended. Everyone talks about it. Everyone recommends it. But unless it's a very sensitive satellite network operation, most likely it's not being encrypted. So here's some examples of where the vulnerability was exposed due to a lack of encryption. There was a Navy satellite that some hackers in Brazil discovered, and apparently they, maybe not they weren't hackers, but they were CB radio enthusiasts knew how to do RF communications, and they discovered that the satellite was open, and they were using the Navy satellite for a long time as for their radio communications, their CB radio. And by the time they finally started arresting people, they got 39 people across 6 states in Brazil arrested, and by the time they got everybody arrested, new people started using the satellite because it was open. Once it gets up in space, it's hard to go bolt security on after the fact. But that is changing because there's a concept called software-defined satellites. Just like we have software-defined networks here on the ground, we're getting the new evolution is software-defined satellites, software-defined radio, et cetera, where we can change the configurations of the satellite. So that kind of architectural limitation is going to be changing in the future. So here's another example. I spoke with some others here tonight about this example of that proves that satellite encryption, like for internet, is unencrypted. There was a piece of malware, if you're not familiar with it, called Turla, that is speculated to have come out of Russia. One of the malware gangs out of Russia apparently come up with this piece of malware, and it's very innovative. We got to admire their creativity and the thought that went into this. And basically what happened with Turla, some end user would get infected, and the end user would communicate back to IP addresses that were located on a satellite network. They were basically satellite end users, internet subscribers. And so they would go and steal an IP address in the footprint of the satellite broadcast. And typically it was in Southern Europe, North Africa, where they were located. And so that end user would get infected, send a message to the C2 server, and that IP address for the C2 server would be located in that satellite internet user broadcast footprint somewhere on the earth, like I said, typically North Africa, Southern Europe. And then when the server responded to the infected system, it would send its response over a fixed landline, so the communication looks async. One part of the communication would come over satellite broadcast, and the return would go over fixed line. So it would be really hard if you're a threat hunter, if you don't have visibility on both networks, to be able to troubleshoot this. And this is only possible because the connections are unencrypted. So another example of a problem with satellite is there was a US-German satellite called the Rosat that was taken control of, and it's speculated that a ground station was hacked, and from that ground station, the satellite was able to be controlled, and it was turned and rotated so back toward the sun, so it ended up being disabled because it was pointed the way it was pointed back at the sun. Ended up disabling that satellite, and it ended up being removed from service. Another example of issue with satellite real world here is there was a satellite called Landsat 7. It had 12 minutes of interference, so they were able to recover control of the satellite, but it was taken control of for a period, both in 2007 and in 2008. Now, if that was a strong encryption controlling that link, the only way to have gotten access to that satellite would have been to go through the ground station. So someone was able to go and throw up their own ground station and communicate with that satellite and influence that satellite because it was unencrypted. Then there's the Turla satellite. It went through 2 minutes of interference in 2008 and then 9 minutes of interference in October of 2008. So again, unencrypted satellite communications enabled this, because on the way to do this is either go in through the ground station that controls the sat, or be able to bring up your own satellite. And if it's unencrypted, then you know it's like we do here on the ground, target it and figure out how to get your own access. But they were able to get back control of the bird. Now, there's another satellite in the U.S. called NOAA NOAA monitors the oceans and the atmosphere in the U.S. They monitor weather. And apparently there was a weather satellite that they managed that in 2014 got hacked by the Chinese. For a period, they were able to recover control of it, but it was hacked. Now, there's a lot of speculation over this one. In the UK, there's a network called the Skynet, and it's a small constellation, I believe it's like 4 satellites that are in this constellation called Skynet. And back in '99, there's a lot of articles published that say that it was taken control of and it was held ransom. Then there's other people, other sources that are saying that it wasn't hacked, but the control channel was influenced. The control channel between the ground and the satellite was intercepted, and for me, that's still a hack, right? It might not have been held for ransom, but there was still a hack. Might not have had total control of the bird, but they were able to influence that satellite. It's just a lot of arguing back and forth on what really happened on that, but there was some kind of event that happened to that Skynet satellite. From a malware standpoint, on the space station that I've been able to find, there was 2 events where malware was introduced to space station. One's from a thumb drive, go figure, thumb drives in space. We have problems with our users on space. Apparently, astronauts use thumb drives as well. And then another infection was caused by a laptop that got introduced into space. Now, it's not just a wild, wild west out there. There are standards, international standards. There's this organization, the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems. It's kind of like, think of like ITU, IEEE, where it's international bodies that write the requirements and best practices for how space systems should operate, the protocols, how everything should be designed and built. Well, they also go and publish a great deal of documentation on recommendations for how to secure these spacecraft, the protocols, the systems themselves. So there are standards, but it's like everything else. You have to go and implement it and design it in early, and not try to bolt it on later. And that's the problem we have is a lot of these systems have been in orbit for many, many years. You can't go change it now that it's up in orbit, but we can go and try to implement better design up front. Now, if you're interested in space, or if you work for an organization that is leaning toward getting involved with space, this slide might have some really good references for you. It's from everyone that I can find that has best practices documented for how to go and secure space systems. And at the very bottom, Germany recently released best practices. I suspect that the European Space Agency will be putting out some references of their own. But there's a whole lot of references from universities and government organizations in the U.S., like I said, Germany, et cetera. And I don't expect you to read this slide. I just want you to know it's here. If you need this information, if you will reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'll send you a Google Drive link with all the slides, all the information, so you can dig into this and save you some time and research finding it all. I was talking earlier about all the different operating systems and command languages and protocols, et cetera. Thought I would throw this out here for everyone's benefit. There's like 20 operating systems, and actually I've discovered another, and there's 21 that I've identified so far of operating systems used in space. Most of the new stuff is a Linux derivative. So everything seems to be converging toward Linux. The new one I discovered here recently was one that China uses for their space systems called Sylix, S-Y-L-I-X. Apparently it's open source out on GitHub. And Space Chain, which is a blockchain space operating system application, it's based on Sylix as well. And then there's like numerous, like I said, there's like 20 other operating systems here for you to check out. From a command languages of how you communicate with the satellite, in the research I have, there may be more. I don't know how many of these are currently in use still today and what's being deployed, but what I was able to find in research were 37 different command languages. And that's what one of my thoughts with like some of the satellites that I threw up that someone accessed it and then they got kicked off pretty quickly. My thought on that is probably because of these command languages. It's like someone that's a Windows expert. They might can control the world with PowerShell, but you go and get on, but that same hacker that's a world-class expert on Windows, they go get on an old VMS VAX box. They ain't gonna know what VMS is. They're gonna be too young for that. Or maybe an old Unix box. Maybe it's a SGI. Maybe it's an SGI derivative, or an old Solaris box. That Windows person is not going to know those old operating systems, and it'll be easier for someone to detect and have time to get them kicked off their system. That's my thought process of what might have happened. When I started figuring out that I've identified 37 command languages, and from a protocol standpoint, I've identified right now around 20 space network protocols. Most of the CubeSats that are up there, they use that CubeSat protocol and the CCS, DS space communication protocol. And in Europe, there's a European Cooperation for Space Standardization, Packet Utilization Standard, ECSS PUS, which is the European standard that a lot of organizations are using. But of course, then there's obviously IPv4 and IPv6 is being used for like Web 1, SpaceX, the Starlink constellation are all using IP. There's quite a number of protocols out there. So if you were to start going and looking at trying to build a threat hunt capability, one reason I put those slides there showing all the operating system command languages to give you an idea. If we start wanting to go and start doing space threat hunting, there's a whole lot of operating systems and protocols and command languages that we're going to have to get tooled up for, depending on what our domain of responsibility is, if we want to start threat hunting. Now, there is some encouraging improvements going on with space. Here this year, the Slingshot satellite was put into space, and it's using that software-defined satellite technology I mentioned, which is basically, the satellite is able to run virtual machines and containers, just like what we run here on the ground, like Docker containers. So that gives you a whole lot of flexibility with being able to change VMs, add new applications. If you just discover there might be a security breach, maybe you could go and pull back a gold version of that container and put it back in operation and take the suspect container out of operation. Intrusion prevention. Everybody's got intrusion preventions on their firewalls here on the ground. Well, this satellite is probably the first one that I'm aware of out in the public research that I've done that is implementing intrusion prevention capabilities. So I thought that was pretty cool to see. And they're also doing, logging and monitoring everything, and they're monitoring for commands, looking for commands to come in out of order, commands to come, out, the wrong sequence, the wrong timing, applying machine learning to that to look for those anomalies in the commands that are being seen so that they can detect someone's trying to help them manage their satellite. So that's a great deal of progress. And like I said, it's using software-defined capabilities so that they can upgrade the satellite and change the configuration. And also, the European Space Agency and some other entities are working on this satellite that they've deployed, and it also has some software-defined capabilities. It was put up in July of 21, and one of the things I saw about it is it has a software-defined radio capability. So if someone starts interfering with the connection, starts jamming, that they can dynamically reconfigure the satellite to protect itself against, if someone is intentionally or unintentionally interfering with its communications. So there's improvements happening with some good research is happening, and there's new satellites being put up there that have cybersecurity focus on them. Now, if you're interested in learning more about space systems and satellite communications, want to do your own research, either just for your personal benefit or for university or your job, This is a good slide for you to help get you started. Everything on here is open source. That OpenSat kit is from NASA in the U.S. The CFS is a CubeSat satellite operating system that flies on a lot of satellites today. Cosmos is a ground station from Ball Aerospace, and 42 is an orbit simulator so that you can model and simulate the orbit of the satellites, and that's all free, and you can download it all as a kit in the OpenSat kit, or you can download it individually. Also, there's the NOS 3, the NASA operational simulator for small satellites. That is another satellite operating system that you could fire up in containers, VMs, and operate in your personal network. And Space Chain OS, I mentioned earlier. Space Chain OS is a blockchain system that was developed by a company in China, Space Chain OS, and it's based on that Silex OS. It's also the Silex OS is used on, my understanding, is used on the satellite systems from China. So, and what I could tell, both of them are available out on GitHub. If you would like to try utilizing those operating systems. And then there's the Artemis project, SatNogs. Those are interesting open source satellite projects. And if a really interesting tool that came available here recently is this tool called Icarus, that if you're interested in modeling and simulating these large internet space constellations like Web1 and SpaceX, learning more about how those work and how their vulnerabilities to like denial of service attacks, go check out Icarus. It's free to download. The researchers published that, and it's free, and it's a very interesting tool that you need to be aware of. So that's what I had to share with you. I believe I went over, but anybody have any questions? Any questions? Well, if you're interested in the slides, or if you're interested, any of the older presentations I've done on network telecommunications, if you hit me on LinkedIn, I'll send you a link, and you can download everything, including the space stuff, if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any audience questions? Can you reach a hand? We stretch a little further than our schedule, so we have very little time for questions. No one? All right. Let's give a round of applause.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.